One rainy night, a billionaire walked into a small restaurant, expecting a quiet meal but instead found a waitress struggling with a forced smile. His actions surprised the waitress. What did the billionaire do? Can you guess? Follow us as the story unfolds. If it were you, what would you do in that situation? Watch till the end and don't forget to like, subscribe, and support Voices of the Underdog. The evening air was cool and damp as the light drizzle fell steadily, creating a soft patter against the pavement. The neon lights of the city shimmered in the rain, casting blurred reflections on the wet streets. Ethan Walker, the CEO of Sterling Enterprises, walked at a leisurely pace, his usual crisp suit slightly dampened by the mist. He had spent the entire day buried in board meetings, handling endless calls and discussing financial strategies that, while crucial, had left him mentally drained. As he strode down the street, he loosened his tie and let out a deep sigh. His life was a constant whirlwind of success, money, and expectations. Every decision he made had consequences, and every move was calculated. He was known as a powerful, ambitious, and highly respected businessman, someone who built his empire from the ground up. But right now, he was just a man in need of a break. The towering skyscrapers of the business district were behind him now. The roads were quieter, the crowd thinner. He had deliberately chosen to walk away from his usual world of luxury and exclusivity, seeking something different. Then, as if by instinct, his eyes landed on a small, unassuming diner nestled between a laundromat and a bookstore. Maggie's Diner. The neon sign above the entrance flickered slightly, the red glow reflecting off the puddles on the sidewalk. The diner had an old-fashioned charm, one that reminded him of places he used to go to when he was just a young man struggling to make ends meet. Without thinking twice, he stepped inside. The moment Ethan crossed the threshold, he was met with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and warm apple pie. The air inside was slightly humid, a stark contrast to the chill outside, and the hum of quiet conversation mixed with the clinking of plates created a sense of familiarity. He took a moment to observe his surroundings. The diner was modest but inviting. The red vinyl booths were slightly worn from years of use, and the black and white checkered floors had faded in spots where countless customers had walked. There was an old jukebox in the corner, playing a soft tune that added to the nostalgic ambience. This was a place filled with stories. A couple sat near the window, sharing a milkshake, their hands intertwined. A group of teenagers laughed over a plate of fries, their energy filling the small space. In the farthest booth, an elderly man sat alone, slowly sipping his coffee as he read a newspaper. There was a warmth here, a sense of belonging that expensive five-star restaurants could never replicate. Ethan found himself drawn to a booth near the window, away from the center of activity. He slid into the seat, exhaling as he finally felt a sense of relief from the day's stress. As he picked up the menu, his eyes drifted toward the counter, where a young waitress was refilling coffee cups. Sophie Bennett. She was moving with practiced ease, balancing plates, taking orders, and offering polite smiles to customers. She had the kind of grace that came from years of experience, despite her youthful appearance. Yet, as Ethan watched her interact with the diners, he noticed something off. At first glance, Sophie appeared to be a model employee, efficient, quick, and pleasant. But there was something subtle in the way her shoulders tensed, something in the way her smile seemed just a little too forced. Her eyes, though bright, held an exhaustion that no amount of coffee could fix. Ethan was no stranger to reading people. In his world, knowing what wasn't being said was just as important as understanding what was. And right now, Sophie was trying too hard to appear okay. A moment later, Sophie approached his table, a notepad in hand and a professional smile on her face. "Good evening. Welcome to Maggie's Diner. What can I get for you tonight?" she asked cheerfully. Ethan glanced at the menu, though he already knew he wasn't here for the food. "I'll have the special," he said, setting the menu down, "and a coffee." She nodded, scribbling on her pad. "Coming right up." For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and Ethan saw something flicker behind her carefully constructed expression. It was there and gone in an instant, but he had caught it, the weight of something unsaid, something she was holding back. As she turned and walked toward the kitchen, Ethan found himself unable to look away. Leaning back in his seat, Ethan allowed his mind to drift. He hadn't meant to come here tonight, hadn't planned on stepping into this small diner, but now that he was here, memories of his own past came flooding back. There was a time when he had been the one standing in Sophie's place, taking orders, refilling drinks, and putting on a smile even when life felt unbearable. He had spent years struggling to survive, working night shifts while studying during the day, barely scraping by. He knew what it was like to force a smile, to push through exhaustion, to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. And now, all these years later, he saw that same struggle reflected in Sophie. A few minutes later, Sophie returned, carefully placing the plate and coffee in front of him. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sophie, are you okay?" She blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. "Oh yeah, just a long day." Ethan didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he picked up his coffee, taking a sip as he watched her walk away. Tonight was just the beginning. He had come here for a simple meal, but something told him he had found something much more important. Ethan Walker sat in his booth, slowly stirring his coffee, his thoughts drifting as he casually observed the diner's movements. The atmosphere remained warm and welcoming, but his focus was drawn to Sophie Bennett. The young waitress moved with practiced efficiency, refilling cups, delivering plates, and taking orders with a well-rehearsed smile. To any other patron, she would appear like any other cheerful waitress doing her job, but Ethan had seen past that. He had spent years in the business world, where reading people was second nature, picking up on subtle cues, detecting forced smiles, and understanding unspoken words. And Sophie. She was struggling. He had caught the flicker of exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders drooped when she thought no one was looking. She was holding something in, carrying a burden too heavy for someone her age. As he took another sip of his coffee, he watched as Sophie served the last table in her section before quickly retreating to the kitchen. It wasn't the kind of departure one made just to grab supplies or take a quick break. She was rushing. Then moments later, he heard it. A soft, muffled sob. Ethan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. His instincts had been right. Something was wrong. The kitchen door swung open for a brief second, revealing Sophie standing with her back turned, her shoulders trembling. A cook glanced at her with a look of sympathy but said nothing. It was clear that this was not the first time this had happened. A moment later, he heard another voice, a quiet, gentle one. "Hey, Sophie, you okay?" The voice belonged to a fellow waitress, a woman in her mid-30s who had been working the counter. Sophie sniffled, quickly wiping at her face before nodding. "Yeah, just a long day." The older waitress didn't press further, simply patting Sophie's shoulder before returning to her work. Sophie, after taking a deep breath, composed herself and walked back into the dining area, her mask of strength firmly back in place. But Ethan had seen it, he had heard it, and he couldn't ignore it. Ethan knew he couldn't just ask Sophie outright about what was troubling her, not yet at least. He needed to understand what was going on. He scanned the diner, looking for someone who might know more about her. His gaze settled on Linda, the older cashier who had been working behind the counter all evening. With her salt and pepper hair pulled into a neat bun and her glasses perched low on her nose, she had the air of someone who had seen just about everything. She would know. Ethan stood, casually making his way to the counter. He leaned slightly against it, flashing Linda a polite smile. "Excuse me, Linda, right?" She looked up, slightly surprised that he knew her name, but nodded. "That's me. What can I do for you, hon?" He hesitated for a moment, deciding how best to approach the subject. "I was just wondering about Sophie." At the mention of her name, Linda's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of concern mixed with hesitation. "She's a great waitress," Ethan continued. "Hardworking, but—" he paused. "She seems like she's carrying a lot on her shoulders." Linda studied him carefully before letting out a small sigh. "She wouldn't want people worrying about her," she said, shaking her head. "That girl has too much pride." Ethan nodded, encouraging her to go on. Linda hesitated for just a moment before finally speaking. "Her mother passed away a few months ago, cancer." Ethan's stomach clenched. "It happened so fast," Linda continued. "She fought as hard as she could, but the medical bills piled up. By the time she passed, they were drowning in debt." Ethan remained silent, absorbing the weight of her words. "Her little brother, Jamie, he's only 13, Linda added, her voice softening. "She's all he has left." That hit Ethan hard. She wasn't just working for herself. She was raising a child. She was barely an adult herself, yet she had taken on the responsibility of being both a sister and a parent. No wonder she was exhausted. Linda continued, her voice thick with admiration. "She's one of the hardest working girls I've ever met," she said. "She took on double shifts right after the funeral. Barely took any time to grieve. Just kept going. Said she didn't have a choice." Ethan could only imagine the kind of resilience that took. He thought about all the people he had met in his life, the CEOs, the executives, the high-powered entrepreneurs who believed they understood hard work. But this was real hard work. This was a young woman sacrificing her own comfort, her own rest, her own future to keep her family afloat, and she was doing it alone. Linda sighed, shaking her head. She never complains, never asks for help, just smiles and keeps going. But she hesitated, glancing toward Sophie, who was now pouring coffee for an elderly customer. "I see it in her eyes. She's tired, and I worry about how much longer she can keep pretending she's okay." Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing at Sophie once again. He had walked into this diner tonight expecting a simple meal, a quiet break from his high-powered life. But instead, he had found something much more important. A young woman who was doing everything in her power to stay afloat, and a realization settled deep in his chest: she shouldn't have to do it alone. As Ethan returned to his booth, he found that his meal had gone cold. But he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. He had spent years building an empire, making deals, acquiring companies, and ensuring his success. But success, as he had always believed, meant more than just making money. It meant making a difference. And right now, sitting in this small diner, watching a young woman fight a battle she shouldn't have to fight alone, he knew what he had to do. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was personal. Sophie Bennett's life was about to change. She just didn't know it yet. Ethan sat in his booth, his coffee now long gone cold, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, the weight of Sophie's situation pressing heavily on his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling of familiarity, the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet resilience, the way she carried her struggles alone. It was as if he were looking at a reflection of his younger self. There had been a time when he, too, had struggled to make ends meet, working double shifts, surviving on instant noodles, scraping by on whatever he could earn. It had been a lonely road, one that required an unyielding will to keep moving forward despite the odds. And now, Sophie was walking that same path. Only she wasn't just taking care of herself. She was raising her younger brother, fighting against debt and trying to hold her world together. Ethan clenched his jaw. She shouldn't have to do it alone, not when he could do something about it. He exhaled, rubbing his chin as he made up his mind. It was time to act. Ethan pushed his plate aside and stood, his gaze sweeping the diner. He spotted Mark, the restaurant's manager, standing near the counter, reviewing receipts. Ethan made his way over, his movements steady, purposeful. "Excuse me," he said. Mark, a stocky man in his early 50s, glanced up. His eyes carried the tired look of a man who had spent years managing restaurants, handling complaints, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He wasn't someone easily impressed. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his tone polite but indifferent. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached up and removed the cap he had been wearing all evening, revealing his face fully. Recognition flickered in Mark's eyes, the moment of realization. His lips parted slightly, his posture straightening as he took a step back. "Wait a second. You're Ethan Walker," Ethan confirmed, his voice calm yet firm. Mark's eyes widened, the gears in his mind turning quickly. Ethan Walker, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, owner of the very chain of restaurants that Maggie's Diner belonged to, the man who could change his entire career with a single decision. Mark cleared his throat, suddenly much more attentive. "Mr. Walker, I had no idea you were here. If I had known, we would have." Ethan held up a hand, cutting off his nervous rambling. "Relax. I didn't come here to inspect the place or critique the food." Mark swallowed. "Then what can I do for you, sir?" Ethan glanced toward Sophie, who was busy wiping down a table, still unaware of the conversation happening just feet away. Then he turned back to Mark. "I want to talk about Sophie Bennett." Mark blinked, caught off guard. "Sophie," he glanced in her direction, frowning slightly before looking back at Ethan. "Did she do something wrong?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "Quite the opposite. I want to know more about her." Mark hesitated, clearly unsure of where this was going. "She's a good worker, reliable." "How long has she been working here?" Ethan asked. Mark scratched the back of his head. "Almost 2 years now." "And in those 2 years, has she ever been late, called in sick too often, slacked off?" Mark immediately shook his head. "No, never. She's always on time, picks up extra shifts when we need her to, never complains even when she's obviously exhausted." He let out a small sigh. "I'll be honest, sir, she's probably one of the hardest working employees I've ever had." Ethan nodded slowly. That confirmed what he already knew. Sophie wasn't just a good worker, she was exceptional. Ethan folded his arms across his chest. "Does she qualify for a promotion?" Mark's eyebrows shot up. "A promotion?" "Yes, specifically to assistant manager." Mark blinked, taken aback. "Well, I mean, technically, yes. She's been here long enough and she's more than capable, but we weren't really considering." "You are now," Ethan interrupted. His tone was final, leaving no room for argument. Mark stared at him for a moment, processing what was happening. Then realization dawned in his eyes. This wasn't a suggestion. This was a decision. And when Ethan Walker made a decision, it wasn't up for debate. Mark let out a slow breath before nodding. "Understood, sir." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "Her salary needs to reflect the position. I want her getting full benefits, health care, retirement options, everything." Mark straightened. "I'll handle the paperwork first thing tomorrow morning." Ethan gave a satisfied nod. "Good." Then, after a brief pause, he added, "One more thing." Mark tensed. "Yes." Ethan glanced at Sophie again. She was still moving through the diner, completely unaware that her life was about to change. "Make sure she knows she earned this. Don't make it sound like charity." Mark nodded quickly. "Of course." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly before he turned back to his booth. This was only the first step, but it was a start. Sophie had spent so much time fighting to survive, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders without ever asking for help. That ended today, because Ethan Walker didn't just believe in success, he believed in lifting others up along the way. And now, Sophie was about to rise. Sophie Bennett had spent the last 2 years believing that life was simply a series of hardships to be endured. She had long accepted that she would have to fight every single day to keep going, that she was alone in her struggles. But tonight, everything changed. Standing in the middle of Maggie's diner, surrounded by the low hum of conversations and the clinking of silverware, Sophie stared in shock at Ethan Walker. The words had already left his mouth, yet she struggled to process them. Effective immediately, you are promoted to assistant manager. The diner fell silent for a moment, as if everyone within earshot had collectively held their breath. Then, a murmur of curiosity and quiet excitement rippled through the small space. Sophie blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. "Wait, what?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression remained composed, but there was something undeniably warm and genuine in his gaze. "You've earned it, Sophie," he said. "Your work ethic, your dedication, it hasn't gone unnoticed." Her breath hitched. Noticed. That word felt foreign to her. For years she had worked tirelessly, unseen, unacknowledged. And now the most powerful man in the restaurant chain, the CEO himself, was standing in front of her, telling her that he saw her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands trembled slightly, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Mark, the restaurant manager, cleared his throat and stepped forward, still looking slightly dazed by what had just transpired. "It's true, Sophie," he confirmed. "Your promotion comes with a raise and full benefits. You'll start training as assistant manager immediately." Her heart pounded in her chest. A raise, benefits. She had spent so long struggling to survive, sacrificing sleep, skipping meals, and barely keeping up with rent and her brother's school expenses. The thought that she might actually have a stable future, a real chance to breathe, was almost too much to comprehend. But before she could even begin to thank them, Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out something else. A check. He scribbled a number onto it, folded it neatly, and held it out to her. "This is for you," he said. Sophie hesitated, looking between Ethan and the check in his hand. Her fingers twitched, but she couldn't bring herself to take it. "Mr. Walker, I can't." "Yes, you can." His voice was firm but kind, his expression unwavering. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took the check. And then she saw the number, $15,000. Her breath caught in her throat. Her knees felt weak. $15,000. Her hands trembled as she clutched the check, her mind racing. That was more money than she had ever held in her life. More than enough to pay off the overdue rent, cover the utilities, put food on the table, and make a real dent in her mother's lingering medical debt. More than enough to give her little brother, Jamie, a chance at a better life. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she furiously blinked them away. I can't accept this," she choked out, shaking her head. "It's too much. I don't know how to, Sophie." Ethan's voice was gentle but insistent, pulling her gaze back to his. "This isn't charity. It's an investment in your future." His words made something inside her crack open, as if all the walls she had built around herself were suddenly too fragile to hold. "You have worked harder than most people ever will," Ethan continued. "And yet, life hasn't given you a fair chance. I'm not giving you a handout, I'm giving you a push forward, a push you've earned." Sophie bit her lip hard, fighting back the emotion threatening to spill over. Her entire life, she had been the one who gave. She gave her time, her energy, her effort, always working, always sacrificing, always putting others first. She had never been on the receiving end of something like this. She had never had someone see her pain and choose to help. She swallowed past the lump in her throat, still staring at the check in disbelief. "Why?" she whispered. Ethan exhaled, his expression softening. "Because I've been where you are." Her breath caught. He understood. The weight of those 3 words shattered something inside her. Her vision blurred as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan reached into his pocket once more and pulled out a small business card. He handed it to her. "You don't have to thank me," he said. But if you ever need anything at all, you call me." Sophie stared at the card, her fingers brushing over the embossed name. Ethan Walker, the CEO of an empire, a man who had the power to change lives. And tonight he had changed hers. She clutched the card in one hand and the check in the other, feeling a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and overwhelming relief. Around her, customers had begun whispering, clearly intrigued by what had just happened. Some even offered her smiles of encouragement as if they too were happy for her. But in that moment, it was just her and Ethan. She wiped her tears and let out a small, shaky laugh. "I'll call if I ever need to." Ethan nodded, his expression approving. Then, with one final glance at her, he turned and walked toward the exit. Sophie watched him go, her heart pounding, her world forever changed. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. The cool night air greeted Ethan Walker as he stepped out of Maggie's diner, the drizzle from earlier now nothing more than a memory. The neon sign above the entrance flickered slightly, its red glow casting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, he simply stood there, inhaling deeply, allowing the quiet hum of the city to settle around him. He had come here tonight seeking a moment of solitude, a break from the relentless demands of his world. Instead, he had walked away with something far more meaningful, a sense of purpose, a reminder of who he once was, and most importantly, a realization of what success truly meant. Ethan had spent years chasing after power, influence, and financial success. He had built an empire from the ground up, turning nothing into something, proving to the world that he was more than just a man with ambition. He was a force to be reckoned with. But for all the skyscrapers with his name on them, the high-end restaurants he owned, and the luxurious lifestyle he had earned, none of it compared to what he had felt tonight. The look in Sophie's eyes when she realized someone finally saw her. The raw, unfiltered gratitude in her voice. The way she clutched that check not just as money but as hope that her life could change. No boardroom victory, no million-dollar deal, no lavish success had ever felt this fulfilling. Because in the end, success wasn't just about how much wealth you accumulated. It was about what you did with it. And tonight, he had used his power not to acquire more, but to give. And that made all the difference. Inside the diner, Sophie stood frozen, watching through the window as Ethan walked away. For years, she had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, believing that no one saw, no one cared, that it was just her fighting alone. And then, in a single night, everything changed. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't alone. Someone had seen her struggles. Someone had cared enough to act. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Sophie smiled. Not the polite, well-practiced smile she wore for customers. Not the forced, exhausted smile she used to convince people she was fine. A real, genuine, heartfelt smile. The kind that felt light instead of heavy. The kind that felt free. As Ethan disappeared into the city, Sophie took a shaky breath and looked down at the business card he had given her. Ethan Walker, a name she had heard before, a man she had unknowingly worked for, but now he wasn't just a CEO to her. He was the person who had changed her life in the span of a single evening. A silent vow formed in her heart. One day, when she was in a position to help someone else, she would. She would remember this night, this kindness, this moment. And she would pay it forward. Because if there was one thing she had learned tonight, it was that sometimes one act of compassion could change everything. And tonight, it had changed her. Ethan continued down the street, the distant city lights stretching out before him. He wasn't leaving Maggie's diner behind. Not really. Because what had happened here tonight, what he had done for Sophie, would stay with him forever. And as he walked into the night, a quiet sense of fulfillment settled deep in his chest. He had spent his life building success. Tonight, he had found its true meaning. In today's fast-paced world, where success is often measured in wealth, titles, and achievements, It's easy to believe that the ultimate goal in life is to accumulate more money, more power, more recognition. We chase after bigger salaries, fancier cars, and prestigious promotions, thinking that these things will define our worth. But Ethan Walker's story is a powerful reminder that true success isn't about how much you earn. It's about how much you give. It's about the impact you leave on others, the difference you make in someone's life, and the legacy you build through kindness and compassion. One of the most profound lessons from Ethan's actions is the power of simply seeing someone. Sophie had spent years struggling, believing that no one noticed her sacrifices, her exhaustion, or the burden she carried. She put on a brave face, forcing smiles, pushing through long hours, and giving everything she had just to survive. Yet, in the span of one evening, her entire world changed. Not because she asked for help, but because someone chose to notice her pain and act on it. How often do we pass by people like Sophie in our own lives? The barista who makes our coffee every morning, the janitor who works late into the night, the cashier who scans our groceries. How many of them are quietly struggling, just hoping that someone will care? It doesn't always take a grand gesture like Ethan's to make a difference. Sometimes, just acknowledging someone's effort, expressing gratitude, or offering a small kindness can change their entire day, or even their entire life. Ethan had no obligation to help Sophie. He didn't do it because he wanted something in return or because it would benefit him in any way. He helped simply because he could. That is what real generosity looks like, giving not because you have to, but because you understand that someone else's burden could be made lighter by your actions. Many people assume that charity is only for the wealthy, that you need to be a millionaire to truly make a difference. But that's not true. You don't need to have thousands of dollars to change someone's life. You just need to have the heart to care. A kind word to someone who is struggling can bring them hope. A small act of generosity, a meal, a ride, a listening ear, can remind someone that they are not alone. A chance, an opportunity, or a moment of recognition can give someone the strength to keep going. No matter how successful we become, we should never forget that we were all helped by someone at some point in our journey. Sophie's story also teaches us another important lesson. Strength isn't just about carrying the weight of the world alone. It's about knowing when to accept help. For years, she believed that she had to fight every battle on her own, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. She worked tirelessly, taking on responsibilities far beyond what someone her age should have to handle. She was exhausted, but she never let herself slow down. Yet, in that moment when Ethan handed her the check, she hesitated. Not because she didn't need the money, but because she had spent so long believing that she wasn't allowed to accept help. How many of us do the same? How many times do we refuse support, reject kindness, or convince ourselves that we have to suffer in silence? Accepting help isn't weakness. It's courage. It takes strength to say, "I can't do this alone." It takes strength to trust that there are people in this world who genuinely want to see us succeed. And sometimes, allowing someone to help us is what gives us the ability to move forward and one day help someone else in return. At the end of his evening, as Ethan walked away from Maggie's diner, he felt something deeper than any business deal had ever given him: fulfillment. He had built an empire, earned millions, and achieved more than most people could dream of. But in that one night, helping Sophie reminded him of something far more important. Success isn't just about titles, money, or prestige. It's about who you lift up along the way. It's about how many lives you touch, how many struggles you ease, and how much kindness you put back into the world. Because at the end of the day, we won't be remembered for the size of our bank accounts or the number of properties we own. We will be remembered for the impact we had on others. So ask yourself, who in your life needs to be seen right now? Who could you help, even in a small way. How can you make someone's burden a little lighter today? Because when we choose kindness, we choose to create a ripple effect that lasts far beyond ourselves. And that is the true meaning of success.